Okay, so this is the audio review for Shades of White by Pamela Perry. Okay, so she starts off by looking at how these different students at different schools would define white American culture. And what she found was that there was a difference. A lot of youth had a really hard time trying to describe what white culture was. They would say things like, well, you mean like American culture, right? Or things like that. And so most of them had trouble explaining it at all, but those who had more interracial interactions did have some understandings of racial privilege. So, white privilege is more about avoiding problems and barriers than it is about whiteness being super rewarded. The example I like to give is like that old SNL bit where Eddie Murphy goes undercover as a white person. And it's basically this whole idea that white privilege is something much more overt. So in the clip, he gets on a bus, and when all the people of color have left the bus, they like pull out champagne and pour everyone drinks. Or he goes into a store to buy a newspaper, and the guy just lets him take it for free. Right, all these kind of things, just kind of this secret world of whiteness. But there is actual a lot of reality to that. When it comes to privilege, it's largely unseen. It's not so much a matter of getting like free champagne on the bus. It's more a matter of not having to be racially profiled, not being discriminated against, not being factored over in cases of employment or housing or a whole host of issues, right? When it comes to racial prejudice making its way into those kind of decision-making processes. So white privilege is really just having less barriers to have to overcome to be considered credible, to be considered smart, to be considered worthy in American culture. So again, some of the youth had some knowledge of this, though it was pretty much divided based on what educational environment they were in. So the focus of her research was on the differences that the two demographically distinct contexts, meaning the two different high schools, made on the ways that white youth reflected on and constructed their white identities. So the white identities at Clavey High School were more variable and contradictory than those at Valley Groves, which she argues that the difference in the white identities were conditioned by different experiences and the structures of interracial associations at their particular schools. So she talks about this idea that white identity is really understood to have no ties or allegiances to European ancestry and culture. So if you ask a white person, oh, do you feel European? They're going to say, what? No, right? Maybe if they have like a particular affiliation, like, oh, they're Italian, they're Irish, they're this or that. But mostly when it comes to this kind of assimilated norm of whiteness, most people don't feel an affinity or a connection to a European identity. So whiteness then becomes cultureless. So it's considered, not having traditions. So to white youth, only ethnic people have ties to the past, right? Whites are seen as present or future oriented and basically without a culture, which is kind of nonsense since what they basically said at the beginning was white culture is American culture. So there was these two different processes she talked about of naturalization and rationalization, which I'll go into more in depth in a second. But naturalization was the embedding of historically constituted cultural practices in that which is taken for granted and seems normal and natural. So meaning, basically going to a white school means whiteness becomes normal. So her focus is not to define what white culture is, but to examine the power that whites exercise when they claim that they don't have a culture. So culturelessness can serve as a measure of white racial superiority because as cultureless, you're just normal. You're simply human. You're post-cultural. You're advanced, right? And so, again, rationalization was her other term, the embedding of whiteness within Western rational epistemology and the value paradigm that marginalizes or subordinates all other things that are considered cultural, right? So again, pushing them down a hierarchy of supposed, white privilege or white, superiority. Okay, so with her specific methods and reflections. So the question she was really trying to address in the research was, what role did close interracial association in school have on the racial consciousness and identities of white youth? So again, this was what she was trying to explore through her research. So specifically, she picked two schools with very different racial demographics, and she gets into very in-depth in the article about that. She focused on participant observations and in-depth interviews. So she outlines in the article how she went about the interviews, how she went about transcribing them, all that fun stuff, how she went about participant observation, meaning sometimes it was like during the day at school, sometimes after school activities, things like that. She just basically made herself a part of the campus culture so that she could observe, what kind of interactions were taking place, how people understood those kind of things, and actually individually interviewing people in an in-depth sense where it's much more like a conversation to try and get at what their meanings or understandings were of white culture. So she used two different high schools. One was Valley Grove, and the other was Clavey High School. So, but what was interesting is she focused on middle-class youth at both schools. So the factor that was really different for them was their social environment and the racial hegemony of their campus life. So as far as participants, she had more than 60 formal interviews when you look at both schools. And she really made a lot of efforts to reach participants and reduce the age difference between them. So the nature of research this ethnographic is you have to make participants feel comfortable. So they're going to act around you as they would if you weren't there. So she tried to reduce the age difference between herself and the participants by dressing informally, letting them use her first name. She avoided hanging out with school personnel that were more her age. So participants were also chosen due to their knowledge and experiences, and of course their racial identities. So the purpose of the research, that she was exploring youth's experiences at school, their experiences of racial difference, how they thought of themselves racially, and how they thought of racial or ethnic others. Really kind of how they constructed those things, as a lot of them understood their identity as opposition to racial or ethnic identities. So she also looked at their cultural interests and other significant identities and what kind of meanings these things gave to their interests and identities. So first, she comes up with this idea of identity naturalization. So she says that this is really a passive construction of white as cultureless. So hegemony, which she uses throughout, is just the assumed norm of the dominant group. So the idea that dominant group values become largely promoted in the larger culture. So they become what is considered norm, what is considered natural, right? So if you think of the nuclear family, right? We think of it as 2.5 kids, picket fence, whatever. What race is that family? Typically it's white, right? So again, this kind of whiteness as a norm, whiteness as just the default category, right? That's what hegemony means in this context. So at Valley Groves, she argued that whiteness saturated youth's lived experiences. So not only demographically, because they were obviously surrounded by a bunch of white people, but also culturally. So the values associated with Western European culture and history, numerically and by political dominance, whites tend to share certain dispositions and worldviews. And our identities are typically formed through this process of our knowledge. And so, especially in white communities, this really manifested itself in a colorblindness view, right? So colorblindness is just a view on modern society that argues that racial distinctions are a thing of the past and they don't affect modern day society. So this is kind of part of this drum beating meritocracy that if you just work hard, you'll succeed in society, of course, but that overlooks structural inequalities in the past that led to inequalities today. And it overlooks the structural inequalities that are still in place today that reify racial inequalities. So, when people say things like, I don't see color, right? Or in the research itself, she had students that identified themselves as human, not as white, right? So again, whiteness just being the default of what humanity is, as if somehow everyone else is askew on that racial hierarchy. But again, if you look back into history, that makes sense. That's literally what people thought through the ideals of, a lot of racial hierarchy systems throughout time, was that there was a biological superiority of whiteness. Right? So again, nowadays, it's not necessarily a biological superiority, but almost a cultural superiority, a cultural just blanket statement of normality. So part of this, again, she talks about this norm-other dichotomy. So one of her respondents was named Billy, and he explained his group of friends as normal. And then to define how they were and how they dressed, he compared them to other groups. So that norm-other kind of dichotomy. So he said, oh, we don't wear baggy clothes like skaters. We don't wear boots and hats like cowboys, right? He basically tried to juxtaposition themselves as normal as opposed to people that had variations on that kind of hegemonic whiteness. So the norm-other dichotomy was also race neutral. So at the school, They were kind of, the social cliques or the social milieu was basically popular kids, skaters, druggies, and what they called homies. And these were not racially segregated groups, though more students of color were in the lower status categories versus more whites were in the popular categories. But they didn't identify people as like a black skater or a white homie. They were just identified as that peer group. So when it comes to adult approval, the adult approval rating of students was very high. There was a lot of confidence and, basically support of youth at the school. Though some of the students that she talked to had experienced issues of racial profiling from administrators. And these experiences were noted mostly by young black men. So this explicit racial treatment of students of color was either not witnessed by whites or just merely forgotten or not understood by them. So she saw this as playing a role in maintaining the pretense of race neutrality on campus. And she talked about the homecoming rally and parade that themselves were, as she describes it in the chapter, packed with assumptions, values, and behaviors, and origin stories that privilege white European American perspectives, as well as gender, sexuality, and class-based norms of white European groups, right? Which, as you read later in the article, was quite a departure from the kind of homecoming celebration experiences at the other high school that she was also conducting research at. So, again, in describing whiteness, they didn't have words to describe those things that to them just came naturally, right? The normal hegemonic view of society, whiteness. So they could say things about their social experiences and identities as whites, not so much their culture, as they would say, oh, I'm just white, or I don't really think of myself as European, right? Things like that. So white youth may not have thought about whiteness as a culture, but they did see it as a social category. And there was a very us versus them construction to this, to what she calls, naturalized whiteness. So naturalized whiteness complements post-cultural identities because there's a clear fit between societal norms and that individual's identity as a white person. So this us-them construction, she argues, revolves around the notions of like being part of a majority or being part of a minority. So naturalized whiteness itself is securely grounded in and validated by the normal way things in the present happen, right? So basically, therefore, we think of whiteness as a future-seeking or present tense notion. We think of cultural values as something lingering to a past or to a long-forgotten notion of how things were in an old country, right? So again, this kind of naturalizes it as, oh, that's just what normal progressive human society is to be white, is to not be mired down by some old cultural tradition of the past, right? So moving on to Clavey, when white is not the norm. So Clavey is one of the most racially, ethnically diverse populations for its size in the United States. So that's why she chose that as the site for her research. Also, the racial composition of teachers and administrators were also much more diverse. So white students were daily up close having associations that were marked by racial differences, right? So they would basically, whether it was their teachers, the principal, etc., they were coming, or fellow students, they're coming in contact with people with different cultural or ethnic or racial understandings of the world. So, basically this meant that, whiteness and race was one of the primary means of sorting out who was who and where you belonged in the social organization of the school. So they also had a tracking structure which was highly racially segregated, which I'll get to in a minute. But certain areas of campus itself, the campus life was pretty racially segregated, as well as peer groups. So since the peer groups were segregated, the activities that they enjoyed with their peer groups tended to racialize the youth themselves, right? So if a group wasn't necessarily only one race, if there was a person, like let's say there's a white person hanging out with a group that's predominantly African American, because of the peer group activities or the things that they would be doing, they would be racialized as that group, meaning, oh, she's trying to act black or things like that, instead of just, oh, she's hanging out with her friends, right? Those kind of things. So the dominant school culture was also very different from Valley Grove's. African American youth claimed the majority of the open public spaces. So Black popular cultural forms and practices shape the normative culture of the school. And so she has to also define what is that culture, right? What is a Black diasporic culture? Basically, she uses a previously established definition that looks at style, music, and the body. and the body itself as the way that Black culture carries potent meanings because it rests at the core of historical efforts of Blacks to assert their humanity, meaning the way that the body is understood and treated has a lot to do with those kind of historical constructions. So when it came to informal and formal activities on campus, these were also shaped by Black popular culture and style and music. So homecoming differed a lot from what Valley Grove's experience was. At Clavey, homecoming appealed to the breadth of diverse interests and cultures of the school. So there was fashion show, there was a range of music being presented. There was definitely a different cheerleading style than the ones at Valley Grove. So, basically at the school, whiteness was not the norm, or white was not the norm, and whiteness was not entirely taken for granted. So the experiences that white youth had at the school is very different just because of that hegemony not being there. So when it comes to this construction of white as post-cultural, even Clavey whites imagine whiteness as culturalist, as post-cultural. So common was also the definition of white as empty or bland, meaningless, just basically not having tradition. So basically, again, like that example I gave you before where someone said that they weren't white, they were human, right? So, she points to the fact that a lot of research looks at this propensity among whites to deny the significance of the past, especially in regards to slavery, because, if we do that, some argue that, it's kind of a defense mechanism the whites have to exonerate themselves from taking responsibility for the legacies of slavery and past discrimination. And also, it's basically that lots of whites deny the importance of the past because if they did acknowledge the importance of the past, they might have to actually do something about the consequences that are still happening today, right? Instead of just blaming it on a personal merit issue or a cultural issue of that group. So her argument's a little bit different. Her argument is that white identity and culture is constructed in such a way that values of individualism, personal responsibility, and this kind of like future-oriented self create a cognitive inability to see things in other ways. Meaning it kind of, the concepts of whiteness create kind of a blindfold on these white students to really see culture as outside of that white norm. So, she talks about how white culture was not entirely naturalized and taken for granted at the school in the same way at Clavey, but at the same time, Western rational ways of knowing and making sense of social relations pervaded school experiences. So we love rationality, right? And Western thought. White people, white Westerners, they love the idea of saying that they're rational, right? Though we could point to many examples of that not being true. So we like to think of the mind conquering the body, of intellect over emotion, order over chaos. And so whites see themselves and their white identity in line with that kind of vision. So otherness in that same way is defined as those things without Western culture's virtues. So being chaotic, passionate, lazy, violent, irrational. And that becomes cultural in the understanding, right? So basically for these white kids, they define themselves as their good cultural values from Western thinking. And they polarize the differences, in that kind of line of thinking on a hierarchy of whiteness being the most rational of lifestyles. So this also is exacerbated by the fact that the school uses very racialized tracking. So tracking is already something very controversial in schools. When you try to separate children on ability level, that's only one factor in their knowledge processes, or even how they learn new information. So, segregating people based on test scores or things of that nature, it can be very detrimental. Obviously, there's a push for people that have high achieving students that they should be separated and nurtured and such. But there's a lot of arguments against, arguments for why tracking is damaging, which I'm going to include a video for this week for you to watch, just to kind of give you an idea of why that is, or some of the concerns about tracking as a larger issue that's kind of outside of this. But anyway, so tracking itself is kind of an issue because it separates children, and also, again, prejudice is kind of the way that we see them. And so for especially kids that are tracked as like middle of the road, kind of like C students, for them, if they're a lot smarter than their compatriots, but they're not as smart as those people that are in the high performing track, then they just kind of give up and just kind of float and don't really achieve what they could achieve otherwise if they weren't kind of split or segregated into these groups that, again, are grouped on one arbitrary measure. When we talk about intelligence, we talk about how intelligence needs to be something that's not just aptitude on exams, but also what is social intelligence, right? The ability to talk to each other. We know that some people that have extremely high IQs have a very hard time talking to people, right? That easy social intelligence. That's a whole skill of itself. Also, there's the idea of emotional intelligence, right? The idea that being able to control your emotions, to use them to your benefit, to not let them control you, is a skill that needs to also be learned and acquired. So that also helps people quite a bit when it comes to business or any of those things. That it's a whole nother knowledge base. So when we kind of separate students based on certain levels of aptitude, we kind of segregate them, and in a way, especially because they're doing racialized tracking, there's, their racial segregation on tracking reproduces racial inequalities in the wider society. So it reinforces racial stereotypes, right? To assume that one group is smarter than the other. It kind of goes all the way back to eugenics thinking of that we needed to, at the time in Western society, they thought it was science to weed out people in society that were not as desirable so they wouldn't be in the gene pool, right? And they really did this whole kind of hierarchy of intelligence as part of this. Though we now know, or what, I guess the original guy who created the IQ did know, but not the dude who brought it to the US, that IQs can change, right? You can learn more and actually develop a higher IQ score. So unfortunately, though, the guy who brought it to the US, this guy named Goddard, did not think that the IQ could change, which is dumb. And so as a result, his some of the policy recommendations that he laid out because of this idea of using the IQ was deporting people, sterilizing them so they couldn't have children, incarcerating them, all sorts of terrible stuff, all based on this kind of flawed notion of what they thought science was about someone's, aptitude leading to their ability to commit crime. It's just this whole thing. But anyway, so there's always been a lot of kind of controversy when it comes to different systems of tracking, because tracking tends to institutionalize the values of mind over body, self-control over lack of constraints. So it racializes those, and it kind of makes students kind of separate into these categories of those who follow the rules and those who don't. And so in a way that kind of goes in line with the previous thinkings of, those who were superior and those who were inferior, right? So at Clavey, she talks about how in the high achieving classes, over 80% of the students in the high achieving classes are white, when only 12% of the student population is white. So that's obviously definitely not a reflection of just kind of equal participation in these programs. So multicultural programs and discourses was another thing that she looked at, how school practices positioned whites as, again, rational and post-cultural. And these things were very well intentioned, right? Giving people opportunities to promote their own cultural identities, to represent different heritage, right? So students saw other people's cultural variations, but they also, in a way, because the white students themselves don't really have a way to promote white culture in a way, it reproduces this white supremacist, rationalist tenet of white colonialism that says that whiteness is just normal and natural, right? Because that's really what colonialism was trying to do, was to say that this is the dominant group and they should have these lands. So in a way, they kind of brought this white supremacist notion as well that, whiteness is culturally invisible. Everyone else is weird. So it's basically like whiteness is its own form of ethnocentrism, right? That everything else is a strange kind of variation of which. So whites would see these multicultural programs and discourses at their schools, and they saw it as an opportunity to learn about other people's cultures, but that didn't necessarily make them reflect on their own socio-cultural location as like white people. But, white identity or pride, they talked about how, she's like, well, why don't you guys have like a white club or something like that? And it was because the students thought that might be seen as a white supremacist act, evidenced by the comment, quote, white is all around. It doesn't need special attention. Otherwise meaning, white is hegemony. So in conclusion, she looked at how construction of white culture as the invisible norm is one of the most pernicious constructions of whiteness in the post-civil rights era, right? That it has just become this kind of unspeakable, just known norm that all are contrasted against, which really causes a problem when you're trying to talk about having any sort of fairness or equality in society. You need to get rid of a racialized hierarchy. But if the racialized hierarchy is invisible, if it's just something that's kind of culturally assumed, very difficult to get rid of. So what her research suggests is that at a predominantly white high school, white identity seems cultureless because white cultural practices are taken for granted. So she calls that being naturalized. And they don't really, because it's natural, you go to school with white people, your teachers are white, they promote white values, you don't really think about it. You don't reflect on or define your own culture. At a multiracial school, white culture was not taken for granted in the same kind of way. So white youth thought about and defined it to an extent, particularly through their interest and taste in popular culture, like what kind of music, or what kind of clothes they wore, things like that. But whites also reflected on their sociocultural location through the lens of European American rational authority, which the school itself was using, and those practices help construct and reinforce those kind of like normalcy of whiteness. So she is saying that it may be that when naturalization processes aren't possible because of close interracial associations between whites and other groups, then rationalization processes have to come into play to preserve white hegemony. So the whole point of, an ethnographic research study like this is to add to existing theory. So she used racial and ethnic identity formation theory to be the foundation of her lit review and understanding. And she was really trying to look at how white culture is considered culturally empty because whiteness is hegemonic and really undefined. That we consider, like, if we think about race, we think about people of color, right? We don't think about white people. So in that way, it becomes an invisible group that's never examined. So, it just becomes the default norm that our brains compare everything else against, instead of being just like one of any potential racialized groupings, right? It becomes the correct, normal racialized grouping, and all the others become kind of a subset or a variation of that. So her research really suggests that, this idea of hegemonic whiteness is really not everyone's experience, right? Those students that were going to a multiracial high school did not have that same kind of like whiteness is culture, norm, value coming from their school in the same way, though it was using Western European thought processes. But white can be visible. So they had to kind of be visible in the fact that they were in a school that had a majority population, of a different racialized grouping. But that didn't make it enough for them to challenge their construction of white as normative, meaning that just because their high school had this kind of value system or a different approach, had more multicultural values and things of that nature, didn't mean that the kind of hegemony of culture, of like American culture being white, that was never challenged or broken down for students, whether they went to the white school or the predominantly white school or the multiracial school.